Steve, thank you very much for those words. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here. It's, I think, 5 years since I was last here talking about the Silchester project. And in those 5 years, an enormous amount has changed. And Steve has alluded to that when referring to our discoveries about Iron Age, about the pre-Roman occupation of the site. Now, this evening, what I want to do is to give you a kind of an overview of the project that we've been involved with for the last 19 years, to give you a sense of how we're learning about change over time, when before we started, we knew very, very little about that. And I also want to introduce you a little to the way in which we've been approaching our finds, our environmental data, our hard artifacts, in learning more about the site as we progress the publication of Silchester. We've called the project the Silchester Town Life Project because that's really what we're after, is to try and characterize Silchester from beginning to end through the window of about an area which represents a sample of about 1% of the area within the walls. All archaeology is working with really tiny samples, and that's true really of us at Silchester. But with that sample, we have an enormous amount of material to contend with. So town life from Iron Age into the early medieval period, and using a variety of scientific approaches to help us understand that a bit better. So for those of you that are new to Silchester, just to sort of put it in its place in the world of Roman Britain, because it's best known for being a Roman town, you see it on the screen there. Here we are, Silchester, and one of the major towns of Roman Britain. It's red on the screen here to pick it out in relation to other towns, Caister by Norwich in East Anglia, Wroxeter, the three towns of Roman Britain which are essentially open. They haven't been built on since the Roman period. And in their different ways, they offer wonderful opportunities to advance our knowledge of the Roman period, that 400 years or more of Roman occupation of Britain, and to provide a framework for the more difficult explorations of all the other towns of Roman Britain which lie underneath medieval and modern successors, and where development has revealed fragments of buildings here and there. So that's where we are, in just 40 miles west of London. So Silchester, and then for many of you, I think a familiar view of the town, where you're looking eastwards across the town at a time when crops were grown within the walls, and as they ripened, you could see the famous street grid that's a hallmark of the town really, and some of the buildings inside. So that's us, and you've got the town wall enclosing that street grid marked by the trees all around. Now, in a major campaign of excavation between 1890 and 1909, the site was to a certain extent laid bare. And what you see there is the plan which resulted, that was drawn up in 1909, published in 1910, showing the achievements of a 20-year campaign to investigate a Roman town. The first time that had been done in Britain, the first time anywhere in the Roman world. And for many years, this was seen to be what a town in Britain in Roman times was like. But we now know that it's only showing us a part of the picture. Because in those days, the excavators, although they achieved a huge amount, they weren't sensitive to change over time, to what we call stratigraphy, and they weren't sensitive to buildings constructed in materials other than stone, built in flint and other materials. So a lot to find out, really. And highlighted there in blue is the block of the town, the insula, Latin for island, the insula where we've been working these 18 years in the field and 1 year fully on the publication programme. So, and looking across rustic rural northern Hampshire into the far distance to the North Hampshire Downs. You're getting a sense of the site today under pasture, and our relatively small area, but something that's kept us occupied for all these years there in the northeast quarter of the town. And you can still see, even in the pasture, some of the streets. If you fly over at the right moment, you can see pretty much the whole street pattern. So we began this in 1997, and the slide on the left there shows the very beginning, and you're beginning to see us revealing what the Victorians, how they went about it, their trenches, and then the buildings they found. And then 18 years later, you see us at a much lower depth, metre and a half deeper, exploring the very beginnings of the Iron Age and the earliest Roman period. So this was a huge achievement, and we reckon something like over 3,500 different people took part in the project over those 18 summers, 6 weeks every summer, and this totally fictitious number, 1 million, but anyway, about 2 million hours of student time, and of course contributions from many, many others. Many of you, of course, are here this evening. So that's, I think, on that slide you see the team, a typical week of one of those last seasons, waving at the camera. So a huge number of people that have made it possible, but above all, the person who really made it possible here is Amanda Clark, who's in the audience tonight. Amanda directed, managed that cohort, all those troublesome students, all those, in the end, 3,500 students. She made the project really tick. And so while there is, as it were, a debt to the mass, there's also a debt to the individual Amanda, who you see on the screen tonight. And from all that work, extraordinary numbers of finds. If you think that in Reading Museum, which contains the collections made from that work of 1819, 1998, I think there are precisely 2 objects from the whole of Insula 9 that you can, as it were, re-find in the collection. And look, we have recorded finds here over 7,500 records. I mean, it's just a staggering amount of new information. And that has still got much new information to yield. And lots and lots of material. Probably museums are glad not quite to see this material yet, because it's still in store here in the university as we work on it. But there are literally thousands of boxes of finds from the project, which are giving this richer characterization of life in the town and how it changed over time. So that's just a sample. In fact, if you look, you can see the boxes stretch right the way to the back, all the way. There are, as Emma Darren knows, thousands of these boxes. But then, first of all, to come back to the site itself, Insula 9, and our trench that we learnt to love over those 18 summers. We start, I think, what I want to do first is to take you through the story very briefly from Iron Age beginnings into almost the most unknown period now, the early Middle Ages. The red defines the area of our trench. So it's about, altogether, only 1/4. So 18 years to do 25% of one block. Multiply that up, and there are, I think, 35 blocks. So if you were to do total excavation, there's a lot of archaeology left in a site which for most of the 20th century people thought there was nothing more to find. And we begin with the Iron Age. We begin with slides taken from the last 2 summers, 2013-14, which show all the complexity of that earliest occupation, where you have the layouts, north, west, southeast, northeast, southwest. Repeated, the right-hand slide is from the last summer of 2014. The beginnings of a regular layout within the overall 80-acre core area of the Iron Age town. So remember, that's our sample of a pattern which we think extends over the whole defended area. But regularity, and within it, and surviving from all the generations of Roman archaeology which followed, of Roman occupation which followed, building after building, generation after generation, still remarkable preservation of those early layers. And to put it sort of simply, here's on the left there is the sort of the basic two-dimensional plan of that phase, the lanes, the tracks leading through the settlement, remains of buildings, the rubbish pits, and in blue you see the well. So the greens are pit, the reds are the lines of the fences which lined the streets, and then down here an attempt to sort of visualize what it would have been like. So buildings in timber, roofing of thatch, animals within the community, relatively low density, I think, of population. But the people that, as it were, did all the work are the people living in the buildings that clustered around the Great Hall here, which we think is one interpretation of the building that occupied this part of our trench, running diagonally across at right angles to the lane, northeast, southwest. So elements of buildings, elements of the remains of their occupation. And this is the period where we're doing all the research now on the finds, working towards to publish it by the end of next year. And that's just for a 60-odd year period of the town. So this slide picks out what we think or could be. I mean, there are other possibilities for this, but this is how we see it. And it fits in with a model of Iron Age society where you have the big chieftain, the kings of the Iron Age, and then the next layer down, and then the retinue that supported them. So that's to give you a sense of that archaeology. And again, another reconstruction of that hall with the big central posts supporting the roof. The Iron Age in southern Britain ends, in a sense, very abruptly with the Roman invasion of south-east Britain in AD 43, AD 44. For Silchester, it's probable that the year in which the Roman army, the occupation, enveloped Silchester, Caleva, was in AD 44. Caleva was one of the few central places in southern England at that time, and it's hard not to think that it was a prime target, not least because one of the great resistors to Rome, a man called Caratacus, had Caleva as his seat at the time of the conquest. Caratacus, the man who then goes into legend as Caractacus, and right up into representations, Elgar's oratoria, and so on. But, so we have that historical episode. In our trench, what do we have? Do we find barrack blocks? Do we find granaries? Do we find the typical remains of a Roman military occupation? And the answer is absolutely not. No, we don't. But what we do have is masses of Roman military equipment, stuff, material that's chucked away, and this is just a sample of those sorts of things, from brooches through bits of strap end that go with their uniform, bits of lorica segmentata, part of their armour protection, and so on. So we have this fascinating question. Did they just simply use? Did you find the centurions and the legions occupying what we think might have been that great hall in, so we say, the summer of AD 44 as they came in, rather than trying to sweep everything aside and create a formal Roman fortress, which they did in other locations? So we have all this hard tack, if you like, evidence of a military phase, but we don't have the buildings to go with it. But what we do find as we move on from 44 is, if there is any dislocation, it's very short-lived, the army moves on, and civilian occupation resumes, and it resumes in a very intense way. This, again, is a gross simplification of the archaeology, but it shows you the continuities from the Iron Age of the routes through the settlement, but it shows a mass of new buildings, which include circular buildings here, and the red denotes the hearth in the middle, in amongst a cluster of wells in blue. So there are more than twice as many wells now in this period, which again is only sort of 40, 50 years in duration, and a great many more buildings altogether. The one thing which is definitely new in this period, and which is consistent with a military intervention and phase, and the arrival of a new order, is the driving of new roads through. And the north-south street, possibly the east-west street, but we think that comes a bit later. But in the 40s, the main routes run through and run over and run across the Iron Age community. But aside of that, there is essential continuity, and even though there are these principal roads running through, these routes remain in action alongside the new. So there's a mixing of the traditional and the new in this period. But an increase in density of population, an increase in activity, and as we'll see later on, a remarkable increase in the wealth of Caleva. And in some ways, this period is Caleva at its height, at the very beginning of the Roman occupation of Britain. So there we have it, and then we move through to a period of great change. Some of you may remember, possibly not, the lecture I gave here 5 years ago, when one of the points I wanted to really make then was the way in which, in the late 1st century, when Roman administration was being implanted systematically across Britain, certainly Britain south of what would become eventually Hadrian's Wall, at that time there was really major change in Caleva, represented by the sweeping away everything that you've just seen and the creation of a completely new settlement round about AD 80. But what really interesting, I think, is that it harks back in a way which wasn't clear in the 40s and 50s, harks back to the Iron Age in a very distinctive way. Because you'll see that the new buildings which are set up in the late 1st century here are aligned once again on Iron Age alignment, running northeast, southwest. And by this time, however, the Iron Age trackways have disappeared, but what remains are the Roman streets. The street grid is really developed and is there as the main communication network within the town. So, major change in the late 1st century, but a change here, as we see it in INSULA 9, which also harks back to the heady days of autonomy of the Iron Age before AD 44. So it's here that you see, even though there's that harking back, looking back, you see the first signs of what we might think of as Roman architecture, sort of more formally, in terms of this suite of buildings here is represented here. They're building in timber, they've got tile roofs, there's a tile industry flourishing in the town, but there's also traditional building totally in timber represented by these thatched roof, this group of dwellings, workshops, but also containing evidence of domestic occupation, and then traces of another big house, timber-framed house, just disappearing off the bottom of our screen, and traces of those buildings there. These are remarkably well preserved, again, somehow escaping the subsequent generations, decades of development within the town. So, what we call early Roman I, what was there before, swept away, and I've speculated in the past that that sweeping away might have something to do with the rebellion of Boudicca of 60-61, but it's very difficult to nail that within the archaeological framework that we have. And then the new town, and very much the Roman town in the sense that from the late 1st century, we have the public buildings which you are familiar with in Roman towns, the Forum Basilica, the bath blocks, the amphitheatre, and so on. But there's still, and this is what's so remarkable about the Silchester story, is you've got a population which is running through from the pre-Roman period with its particularities, which here are reflected in the construction of these buildings, which adopt again that Iron Age alignment and maintain it in the way they're built for a few more generations. So let's rush then through to the second, taking us through towards the middle of the Roman period to about AD 200. And the real development here is that now they start building in masonry foundations, perhaps with timber frame superstructures, but you see very much, if you like, a reinforcement of what you've seen before. The main house occupying almost the entire width of our trench running there. It's just rebuilt in masonry. Timber buildings, less easy to distinguish to one side, and there. I mean, it's very much continuity. The period from the late 1st century to the mid to late 3rd century is one of stability and little change, except in the way in which people build. So then we come on to the 3rd century. Houses are rebuilt, reorganized, reconstructed, and then there's the second phase of major change within our area and reflected elsewhere in the town. All of this goes. This is, I suppose, the main building that the Victorians found in 1893, which they called House 1, and you see it on their plan. But actually, it had gone before AD 300, somewhere in the second half of the 3rd century. All of that swept away. And our last phase, which takes us into the 5th century, has a new order, a new organisation with buildings which now align with the Roman street grid. So they're small cottages. There's a sort of artisanal flavour to the life of the town. We'll come back to that. But a series of buildings which front onto the north-south street here. And then their backyards with a series of pits defining the boundaries between the properties, and then a scatter of wells, of which we'll come back to that one later on. And so reconstructed here are these cottages set back, introducing new materials. And one of the curiosities I think about Calaver is the way in which, as we go through town, they use more what we regard as expensive materials for their building, including using stone slate for the roofing, as Margaret Matthews' reconstruction shows here. Stone slate, some of it coming as far away as the Forest of Dean, when you could actually make a perfectly good roofing tile, as they'd done earlier, just outside the walls. Why that should be so, we don't know. So that takes us through and then on into the difficult period of the 5th century, after the formal administration of Britain by Rome ceases. So that's the story from about 20 BC into the 5th century. And whereas in 1893 they could see just, as it were, one phase, we can see these 6 clear stages, and within them lots of complexity. In some senses, though, the story in terms of the archaeology doesn't actually end with the period after Rome, after the beginning of the 5th century, because we now have to embrace within our story what the Victorian excavators did. It's not just the Society of Antiquaries of 1890, 1909, there's earlier work as well. And one of the first things, this takes us back to 1997, 1998, teasing out the way in which they set about exploring the town, using these narrow trenches, exploratory trenches, and then when they hit walls, expanding to recover the footprint of individual buildings. So in the sort of purple there, you've got the lines of Victorian trenches and the way they exposed just those 2 buildings. I can't honestly tell you now how many buildings altogether we have from Iron Age up to the 5th century, but we're talking of dozens of different buildings, so from 2 to 30, 40, I don't know, but we're still working on that, but it just gives you an idea of the richness of what there is to find. And then the photograph of the Victorian excavators in the Diamond Jubilee year, with that great pot in the top right corner, and the Victorian trenches, giving you a sense of that excavation. And then we have the traces of what they left behind. And maybe there are similarities with the traces of what we might have left behind in 2014. But dug through one of the streets was a big pit in which a great mass of material had been thrown. Most of it was Roman, including items which are not actually represented in the material that was retained and given to Reading Museum. So it's a remarkable collection of stuff, but none of it particularly spectacular. However, amongst the finds was this little array. So we run through from sort of morning break with these mineral water bottles, and you can see Basingstoke, so they're made in Basingstoke. You run through to afternoon tea here, and then to end the day, the whiskey bottle at the back. So that's sort of, there's an element of continuity in that tradition, even in modern archaeology. So the Victorians, and they're a very major part of the story of Silchester, and the collection that you see in Reading Museum is a major part of that story. So, and also out of that story comes some remarkable coincidences in a way, because we have actually managed to join up here a piece of pottery which we found in about 1998, and this is down to the eagle eye of those that study this particular project, but we found this in 1998, and it joins with a sherd in Reading Museum. The sherd in Reading Museum doesn't say where it came from in the town. It might have come from our area, but it might have come from hundreds of meters away. But it's nice, isn't it, to think that after all these years, you can make these links from new finds and old. And this is actually, it's a unique vessel as far as we know, it's certainly from Britain, but you can see these little salamanders dancing along the rim of a vessel, which was made in a place called Rheinsarbahn in Germany in the 3rd century. So there are those nice links to be made as well. But from, as it were, that story of development from Iron Age into the 5th century, let's turn to now some of what we're finding out about that life, about life in the town. And throughout the project, we've been blessed with tremendous support from Mark Robinson and from Lisa Lodwick, from Lisa now here, from Oxford, helping us with understanding the very rich legacy of plants and foods that we have here, coming from painstaking work of sorting out these from the samples of soil that we take from wells and pits and so on. And the story has an exciting beginning in the sense that what we're finding in the Iron Age are the first traces of, if you like, Roman Mediterranean food types and flavourings. So these have never been found in pre-Roman Britain before. Presence of the olive, of coriander, of celery, of dill. All these are new and give an indication of the sophistication and the wealth of the Iron Age community there. And it gets better and better, because as you come into the 1st century, you find a greater variety of types of food that are being imported. So we've got figs for the first time. Lentils are probably being cultivated or certainly being imported for the first time, cherries, mulberries. And then we find in the latrine pits masses of these of blackberries, of local fruit. So this represents a sort of healthy element of the 1st century diet. Grapes, of course, as well, which turn up in other forms too. And then as we go through time, more exotic imported foods. So a cucumber that's been pickled in some way, imported, perhaps from southern Spain. And it's in the 3rd and 4th centuries that we really see evidence for cultivated apples as opposed to sort of wild crabapple types. Cultivated apples that originated, which have come into the Roman world from Central Asia, from Kazakhstan. And so these are some of the mineralized, these are almost like little fossils of apple pips, but you've got figs and walnuts still, right the way through. Some of our latest deposits have got still this evidence of links with the Mediterranean world. So that's a sort of profile of the food, and of course food only goes one way, and we have to remind ourselves of what it also leads to and what that can tell us about the environment in which these people lived in Caleva in the Roman period. And there are various approaches to that, and here is just an insight of what you can, as it were, learn from a slice of soil taken from, in this case, the floor of one of our timber buildings. But when you look at this under the microscope, so here you see a block of soil that the sample's been taken, put in resin, and then a glass slide produced. And you can see, you observe layers, you can see more subtlety in the layers of soil. And within those, you can identify components which help understand what was going on. And so this is the floor of one of these timber buildings. And one of the things which emerged from Rowena Banerjee's work is that you've got evidence for dung from herbivore animals, so from cattle or perhaps sheep, but you've got these animals. This is actually, up to now you might have thought, well, they probably did bring animals into the town, bring them in for the winter or overnight, but here you're actually getting the hard evidence for it from this analysis. So you've got the dung within the trample of the floor. And in this particular building, there's lots of it. So in the reconstruction here, you can imagine that it's perhaps beginning to decay, but it's a stable area where a few animals are kept. And they're kept right beside the big house. So micromorphology, studying the soils in depth, gives us insights which we couldn't, as it were, learn from the digging. So often, I think people think that the digging is the end of it all, that once you come away from the trench, there's nothing more to learn. But it's not the case at all. There is so much richness here. And just to think about the animals and what they're doing to the soils, the pollution, and the sorts of things we find. So beetles that are particularly fond of herbivore dung, these we find from waterlogged deposits. Nice trickling filter fly, really runs off the tongue, trickling filter fly. You won't forget Cycoda alternata, which again, evidence of polluted water, polluted soils. So you're beginning to feel you wouldn't really want to live there, would you? And just to bring that home, then some of the other things that we find that remind us that life perhaps wasn't as pleasant as it might have been. So I think many people would have had whipworm, which maybe there weren't particular symptoms, but it can, particularly if you're young, children, it can be very serious. But these sorts of disease from food that's not being cleaned or cooked properly mess around, and we do have I would regard as priceless mineralized maggots here, fossilized calcium phosphate maggots. But just in case you don't believe, that's the real thing above. And that, of course, is the egg of one of these. And I don't know, well, some of you may have some of these, I don't know, but but I think a lot of people in Roman Britain certainly had whipworm and other infestations. So there is that aspect. It's life. It's quite dirty, water possibly polluted, disease. That's affecting younger people more than older people, perhaps. But it gives you a sense in which people lived and work. And so we come on to the theme of occupation, things that they do, and again the insights which some of our scientific work has revealed. So let's start with the big stuff, start with gold and silver. Excavating in the ground, we could find no trace of that. But from the chemical analysis of some of our soil samples, we could identify really quite high concentrations of gold, in particular coming from what the Victorians called House 1. So gold and silver. The blue is silver. The red, not quite so abundant, is the gold. But precious metals, gold and silver. And we've done more work since then to show that actually there are these pockets of precious metal working in Silchester. It's not that I want you to rush out and start panning for gold out there, because that's not a good idea. But there is a sense of this sort of metalworking going on. And one possibility here is that actually they're beginning, here in this house, they're actually beginning to recycle perhaps some of their hoarded wealth from the pre-Roman period. So there's that going on with the working of bronze and copper, and more commonly, and particular in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the working of iron. And my colleague John Allen suggests that they're not just forging ploughshares or making nails, making artifacts, they're also smelting the ores to make iron, the material itself, which is then forged into artifacts. And so on the one hand, you've got these mass slag basins from that process of getting the metal from the ores, and on the other, you have these microscopic residues that Rory Williams-Burrell is more than familiar with, these microscopic residues which come extracted from the soil samples that we take. But they give us a sense of these activities. So none of this really clear as you're digging. The larger masses, yes, but where were they forging? That only comes from this later microscopic work, study of those residues. And we can see, crudely, that they concentrate in different parts of, even within our small area. It's not uniform. They concentrate in the corner here, southeast corner, is where there's a lot of that working going on, with a hint of it perhaps going on the western side of the block as well. So, iron making, iron forging, and in the 4th century, it does seem to be the waste is widespread. All the black dots indicate you've got this waste turning up in rubbish across the whole of our area, and it goes on right to the bitter end. So the right-hand image here with this big black, this is taking us beyond 400, so that there are in the community, even after the Roman administration has withdrawn, there are people with those skills for making and forging, these absolutely core skills that you need to function if your farming is going to work, if you're going to keep your house up and so on, if your carts are going to roll. These skills are still there and they're present in the community in the 5th century and going on. So that's a metalworking from the very high, the grand, the gold and the silver, downtown. These are very important elements of life in the town. And this reconstruction here just sort of gives a sense of the insula in that period, towards the end of the 4th century, the houses running up, these workshops, this overall artisanal flavour to our insula at that time. And you can see here the blacksmith at work. And everything here we've drawn from the archaeological record, whether it's the goats down here present in the yard behind, the dogs in the street, and then the blacksmith focused there at the back of his property. And work and life go together in the same buildings. Something which I think came to us as a bit of a surprise, and again is where, if you like, the microscope helps illuminate the past, is that while we were familiar with finding dog bones, remains of dogs, what we weren't familiar until Claire Ingram, our zooarchaeologist, looked at the material, we weren't aware that our dogs were being skinned. I think I don't know if the tweet's going out, there's a tweet going out about how they loved their dogs so much they then had to end up wearing them. Because that's what they seem to have done. A dog pelt industry, interestingly in the same house and environment where they're also, they're multi-skilled, these Romans, they're working iron as well. But dog skinning is something that we've discovered, and I think Silchester is still unique in demonstrating this sort of aspect of Roman life in this case, in the 3rd, early 4th century. So it all takes place down in this is a busy area, the dog skinners are at work down here, and took your dog along at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I liked something back by 10 o'clock tonight. And so it went on for generations. And this gives you a sense of what it was like in this environment, because here you have them busy at work. There we are, busy away, skinning away, nice pelts hanging out there. Somebody here trying to ignore it, rushing home not with an amphora of wine, I just emphasise, but an amphora full of olive oil for healthy cooking, healthy eating. But the story here in this particular ends with a remarkable sequence, really, and you can speculate on as you like, but around about towards 300, somebody dug a pit, which might have been used initially as a cesspit, and as it was filled and deliberately filled, into that fill went the complete skeleton of a puppy. There, you can see it curled up, there's the skull. This remarkable folding knife, that's the blade down there, ivory knife, in it goes with a dog. And then beneath it, again rather symbolic, is this raven tucked away. And in amongst it, there's lots of ordinary rubbish, including the remains of other dogs as well. So there's this event, perhaps a significant event, where whoever it is perhaps sacrificing this last puppy, throwing away their puppy skinning knife, which is a high quality elephant ivory object. Again, has there's nothing similar from Britain. So with all this in a small cottage tucked away in the town, and this symbolism of death and whatever, the raven underneath it all. So that's perhaps the most dramatic example of some of the things that we've recorded that relate to ritual and superstition in the life of the town. And we can see that in a number of different ways. Something else, moving away from those poor puppies, just looking at rituals associated with water, and something I think almost every well that we excavated contained at the bottom at least one vessel which had been deliberately pierced. So this one here come from this well just being excavated there, sort of late 1st, early 2nd century. Not all from wells. This, you can see the deliberate hole that's been made here. This comes from what looks to be a foundation deposit for one of our buildings. So a complete, absolutely complete pot alongside one with a... So what's all that about? Why are people deliberately piercing their vessels? Is it something to do with an offering to the deities that ensure that water flows, and this is an offering and you drill a hole so it won't float out, it'll sink and be there? Or is it something else? And why is it that it occurs in a dry context, in the foundation context, as with this vessel? But this we can trace from the Iron Age right through to the 5th century. That tradition continues, the piercing in the water and in other contexts too. And it's just people just concerned about their future, where the next bucket of water is coming from, perhaps. And concerns too about the safety of their buildings. Will our house stand up? Why else would you put your niece's jawbone in your foundations? Because here, and put in skeletal form, is the jaw of a youngish lady, female. My experts, Mary Lewis, assures me. Somebody who has a great sweet tooth, massive caries in there. Ooh, awful painful. But somebody has retained this and placed it in the foundation of this building. And you can see that's where it comes from, the foundation of one of our late 1st, early 2nd century workshops. So these deposits, which I think are there, I mean, nice, strong-jawed and sure your house will stand. I don't know, but people, I think it's they're always looking over their shoulder, looking over, not sure, needing to make sure the gods are on side. And perhaps rather, again, in the same vein, is the discovery of an articulated deer foot, again, deliberately placed, so it's still articulated when it's placed in the ground, as you see here, in the foundations of another building. So these associations in rubbish pits, associations with water, associations with construction, all these little acknowledgements of another world or another worlds by the people living in Kaleva. And then, of course, the deer that you find here is the deer that also run across the tiles as they're being made outside the town. And references back to the most, well, really quite distant past, too, incorporated in foundations. So here is a polished Neolithic flint axe so it's more than 3,000 years old when it is deposited, it's picked out and put in the foundations of, in this case, the house next door to where the female jaw came from. So another piece of this story, a reference back to a remote past. People would have picked these up in the fields and what is this? What is this? And there are other instances in Roman Britain where these have been found clearly picked up and clearly thought to be a significant item relating to a remoter past. And then in one of our last roundhouses, as that architectural tradition died out in the late 1st century, some remarkable associations within the foundations of a complete pottery vessel, the burial of an infant here on the left, a neonate, and then the cremated remains of sheep, headless sheep. The heads have been removed elsewhere. The cremated remains of sheep, which presumably had been part of a feast and part of a ritual associated with the construction of what I think in many ways would have been quite a symbolic event, what, as we now know, was the building of the last roundhouse. Again, another reference back to that Iron Age past, but well on into the Roman period. And then back to dogs. There are a lot of dogs from Silchester, and I know Maeve Kennedy from The Guardian is keen on our dogs. And we found them not just in the context of the household which prepared the pelts, for the dog pelts, but we found them really throughout the whole sequence. So this little dog is from the Iron Age, but the formal burial of dogs occurs throughout, alongside a churning which sees them just simply as parts of the skeleton, parts of the dog. Perhaps originally completely buried, but then later activity disturbing them. So we have this, dogs clearly have an important role in society right the way through and into the 5th century. And we can see this perhaps emphasized if we just look at it, if you like, spatially across the trench, because here where our dog is, so they concentrate around our late Roman houses here. There are not many further afield, another cluster around this property here. 1 or 2 out there. So these are masses of, some of which are complete skeletons. But what's interesting is that in the same pits and rubbish, we also find the remains of the neonates. So infants and the dogs together, close to the household at this particular time. And while you can trace the, if you like, the respect in relation to the dog back into the Iron Age, the tradition of infant burial in and around, and sometimes in the foundation of houses, is something which doesn't seem to occur until after the Roman conquest. It's a Roman introduction. Adults, of course, buried outside the town, but infants that haven't yet, as it were, developed a soul are clustered around close to the house. So infants and dogs in the 4th century. So that's aspects of life. One could take that further, but I want now to move sideways and look just briefly at some of the implications of some of the finds that we're making. From the Iron Age, where we're doing all the research now, we have on the one hand this evidence of a sophisticated society using coins which are struck in a Roman style, but with an acknowledgement of Iron Age. So on the one hand, you have a bust which very much mimics. This is kind of a copy of the bust of the Emperor Tiberius, but the gentleman here is VERICA, one of the kings of Caleva, of Atrebates, and then on the reverse of the coin, you've got the remains of an Iron Age neck torque of probably gold or silver. The examples that you can see in the exhibition, the British Museum, the Celtic exhibition now. And Latin here in the Iron Age period. But connections, Iron Age, it is, in sort of European terms, it's a global society. It has links from within Britain and across southern Britain, but also right the way across through to the Western Mediterranean. And these vessels represent different aspects, different finds. The hard tack, what survives so much better in the archaeological record, represented here. And you've got Italy represented, southern Spain, and then a great chain of material that comes from France, and much material from northern France. And there is that strong link between Caleva and northern France from the region around Arras. And that same tribal name, Atrebates, we find there in northern France as we find it in Britain. So the Iron Age, and then we come back to, remember I said that the period from the mid-40s through to the 80s was perhaps the richest period in the whole life of Caleva. This is the period where we find evidence of imperial investment in the town, represented by the occurrence of these tiles with the imprint of the Emperor Nero. Question is, where does all this come from? And in Insula 9, we were finding not just fragments of these tiles, but we were finding, there's the NER on that fragment emphasized, but we were finding also monumental masonry. So this is material which has become rubbish by the late first century. It's being reused, but it's high quality stone that's come from the quarries 60 miles away to the west in Bath, where this material is still quarried today. So we found these hints in Insula 9 of something really rather monumental occurring somewhere, but not in our area. And alongside, if you like, this hard material, the bricks of Nero, this stone, we've also got some really quite exceptional finds. So this figurine of Harpocrates, an Egyptian deity that's been sort of adopted by Rome in a sense, but here used just as ornament for something that might have been a warm winer. This is the sort of thing you can see in the museum in Naples from Pompeii, remarkable bronze objects, again of which there are no other instances of this date at this time in Britain. So, but we're finding the scraps, the leftovers, which have been curated, perhaps because he's an interesting figure, this Harpocrates. People were, again, wanted to hang on to him rather than put him back in the melting pot. Harpocrates, this is the period we think Emidarum believes that the Silchester, the famous Silchester eagle, the eagle of the 9th of Rosemary Sutcliffe's great story, that this is the period of the eagle, of monumental fine statuary decorating some great house within Caleva. And it is a very, very fine piece of work that you can see in Reading Museum now. And there is, this is something which just being really looked at now, there is this remarkable glass, really fabulous glass, of which we see some glimpses beginning in the pre-Roman period. So, but we're dealing really mostly with fragments, the sort of fragments that you can see here, multicolored glass, but which turn into, if one had the whole thing, vessels like this, absolutely glorious polychrome vessels with this gold finish that are made in workshops in Italy. And again, gladiator cups, these rare items. And these are occurring in these years from the mid-late 40s into the maybe 60s, maybe curtailed in 61, we don't know. But there's a lot of wealth and the fragments survive. And it is a super collection of this exquisite material that's found here in Calaver at this time. Look at the workmanship, the marvelling on this bottle on the right-hand side, and this blue glass on the left. And people are, yes, rings, gems, 10 a penny. So we find, again, what's falling off their fingers, and some lovely items too. And some of you will have seen, I think, Minerva here on the left is one of my favourite images that come from that period. But there are, just from our area, a remarkable number of gems from finger rings that date from this period. So gems. And all of this material, so tantalising. What does it mean? What was Nero up to? What was going on in Calaver? This is the period where southern England is perhaps semi-autonomous under a client king. What's going on? And so that led us in 2013 to go southwards and look at another area where the Victorian records suggested that there was early and significant and monumental building, and that might have been a context for some of the material that was otherwise occurring, you know, stone being reused as foundation in buildings, as foundations for posts and so on up in Insula 9. Did it come down from nearer the centre of the town? And that led us to Insula 3 in 2013. And just simply by re-exploring the Victorian trenches, just doing the most economic excavation that we could, we were able to re-establish the plan of what they'd found, to work out what was real and what was not. And you've got the traces of a building which is going beyond the limits of our excavation, which led to us doing more work there this summer. But a building, not a bathhouse, as they thought in 1891, but part of a palatial residence, occupying at least the southeast corner of Insula 3. But is it Nero? Is it not? As yet, we have yet to find one of these tiles, and we found plenty more in 2013-14 of these Neros. We've got yet to find one actually embedded in a wall. So, in a sense, the quest still remains. And of course, that's the great thing about our site. There are always new questions to address. But what we have established is this is early, it's first century, it's monumental, and it might well be related to the Neronian phase, but we can't be sure. And it's part of this hidden Calaver, the Calaver of the client kingdom of the mid-1st century AD. And then, just leaping from the 1st century to the end. One can't not conclude a lecture on that 500-year trajectory without saying something about the end. And here is the iconic object that's associated with the very end of Calaver, which is called the OGHAM stone. It was found in Insula 9 in 1893. It's one of those two objects that you can identify in Reading Museum from that area. And it carries this inscription, which is a transliteration into, using Latin letters. These horizontal bars off the vertical axis represent different letters of the Latin alphabet, but the language is Celtic, and it reads Tebecatus Maci Moiko. So Tebecatus is the name, and reads from bottom to top up the left-hand side, Tebecatus Maci Mukoi, which is son of the tribe of ... And that formula, what you call the Maci Mukoi formula, is something which you find on similar stones with that similar way of writing Celtic using Latin letters across in southern Wales and in southern Ireland. So whereas at the beginning of Calaver we have those strong links to northern France and to people coming across, settling, Atrebates, at the very end we have this amazing link with the West. And this stone, found upturned in one of the wells associated with this modest cottage in Insula 9, somewhere between 400 and 600. So it takes the story beyond 400, but it also opens up that link to the West. And this is where you find similar inscriptions, this way of writing Celtic. You find them in Southern Ireland, massive examples there, and in South Wales, and then all on its own, Calaver. And why is it here? It's because I think Calaver, even after the breakdown of the Roman administration, it was still on a major road network, and people, you know, you catch the ferry today to Fishguard, coming across, and this is the way you'd go. You'd either go to London to get the boat across the channel, or you'd go to somewhere like Richborough. So still pivotal after 400 in terms of the movement of people, this case from Southern Ireland. So that's another and a new element right at the end of the history of the town. But as to the very end, well, in 2013 we found evidence from within the town which suggested that there was occupation which went on, not just the OGHAM stone and what that represented in terms of a community, a Celtic Irish community in Calaver, but also other material, very rare, that begin to fill that gap after 400. So this very distinctive form of pottery that you see represented here on the left, with it, where the organic materials have fired out, leaving these voids. Very distinctive 5th to 8th century pottery. But why is it that Calaver is about? That's one of the frequently asked questions. Why is it? And we're here into realms of conjecture and speculation. But one idea that was recently suggested by a colleague at UCL in London is that actually Calaver was part of a frontier system between the growing Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex to the south and the kingdom of Mercia developing in the 7th century, 8th century to the north. So Calaver at the eastern end of a frontier system which incorporates the great earthwork of Wanstead that runs through east to west through Wiltshire. So that's a possibility that there, the town on a frontier, it's neutralised, it becomes perhaps simply a small garrison, and that leads to the abandonment by the population. But of course there isn't complete abandonment, because we see the population emerging again in the 11th century around what is now, of course, the parish church of St Mary and the medieval village on the eastern side of the town. But that's a possible scenario, the frontier story. Nothing to do with the end of Roman Britain, but very much to do with the emergence of Anglo-Saxon England. So that sort of brings us to the end. So that's the ending of the field project, where such an occasion it was, everybody chose to lie down in the trench on that very last day. So a huge thank you to all of those, and then a huge thank you to all of those that really made it possible in terms of helping us finance the project. A remarkable number of individuals, some of whom are here tonight, and trusts and foundations which have made not only that digging possible, but of also helping us to enrich that story, the life of Calaver from Iron Age right the way through, building up that story. So a big thank you to you all. Thank you.